deep dive into the 5-yearly requirements for hydrostatic testing of fire hydrant systems. I am delighted to say that we have 3 guests with us today on this webinar. This is the biggest webinar we've ever done with the most amount of interest so far. In fact, we have, when I posted this online, I had put it on Facebook and asked the question of the community, how many people, what questions do people want? And I was overwhelmed with the amount of responses. So my name is Russ Porteous. I'm your host for today, and I would like to introduce our guests. But as I mentioned, we're covering a whole bunch of different subjects relating to fire hydrant systems. The first guest that I'd love to introduce you to is Greg Aspinall. Many of you will know Greg from his work in the fire industry, particularly in Victoria, and his company, Aspinall Fire Services. So, Greg, perhaps you could introduce yourself very briefly.
Hello, everybody. I'm Greg Aspinall, as Russ just informed you. I am a fire service inspector, mainly hydrants and hose reels, and I guess I instigated pump appliance and hydrostatic testing in Australia, really, due to the 1994 requirement. And here we are still doing it. It doesn't make you very rich.
Hey, Greg, thank you so much. I think you sometimes understate your contribution to the fire industry in Australia. Our next guest is Bevan Phillies. Bevan is from Sydney, and he's the Senior Operations Manager for Flow Testing for AFT Fire Protection. So, Bevan, perhaps you could just give us a quick intro to yourself.
Yeah, sure. So I am a licensed plumber working for AFT Fire Protection up in Sydney, as previously stated. I've been in the fire industry now for 12 years, working on all facets of systems, so sprinklers, hydrants, hose reels, and the pumps that drive those systems. And most recently with AFT, I've just started working with the fire truck and, just utilising that to do testing, actually utilising the truck itself. So, yeah.
You're on mute, Russ.
I am on mute. That's the worst offence that you could possibly do on a webinar. Bevan, one of the things that I learnt about in the research for this is that you're a licensed plumber and you also teach at TAFE New South Wales.
That is correct, yes. So that's just probably the latest thing that I'm currently doing. So I've just been doing that for a year now. It's probably ignited a bit of a passion just in terms of, teaching those guys just, I guess, flows and pressure. I think it's something that is not necessarily pushed from that teaching level, probably glanced over a little bit. So, it's enabled me to really spend more time trying to get them to understand and basically just try and make it so that it's quantifiable, so that they, whether it be litres a second, litres a minute, they just understand that side of it and how they can convert and move on from there. So it's been good.
Excellent. And that's a great segue into our last subject matter expert and guest today, Darren Evans. I have engaged with Darren many times, both in the real world and in the virtual world, particularly in the Facebook groups for fire systems. Darren is the director and CEO, founder of Pacific Institute of Technology. And Darren, perhaps you could tell us a little bit about your experience in teaching people and how you come to be so active in the online community about fire safety.
So I came originally as a technician and designer, and when I got my degree and became a consulting engineer. But I found it I worked in major consultancy firms, so internationals, doing jobs all over the world, but it was virtually impossible to get staff. So other designers to other engineers to work with me. Literally, I was given new, fresh engineers who had never done anything in fire. And then as a result of that, I would teach them. They'd hang around for a year or two, and then people would offer them more money because they couldn't get people. So in a way, they were, better than what they started out with, but certainly not at the level. Got a call from someone over in Western Australia, of all places, saying, what courses are available? And I'd say basically the unis over in New South Wales and Victoria at that stage. And then I happened to be out at lunch with someone, and they said, "Oh, you heard about the new diploma?" I said, "No." And then I mentioned that in forth to the person in WA, and they said, "Would you be happy? Would you teach it?" And I went, "Oh, maybe." And as a result of that, I started teaching the diploma about 13 years ago. And then I set up. Initially, I was working with someone else, and then I set up Pacific Institute of Technology. And we do, virtually all the training. We stick away from the sprinkler fitter trade, but apart from that, we do, obviously the design, annual certification, parts of the diploma, and we do, gas licensing and sprinkler testing and hydrant testing and testing, basically all the testing of systems.
So thanks, Darren. At the end of this webinar, I'm going to give you all an opportunity and our guests today to join in and get specific information if somebody wants to reach out to you, whether it's a building owner or facility manager or somebody in the trade who's looking for a skilled craftsman in the industry. So we'll be sharing the contact information for each of our guests later today. As I mentioned earlier, we're going to cover off, time permitting. We're going to be finished by 10 a.m. A whole lot of stuff covered in table 4.4.4. We will touch on table 4.4.3 of AS1851 as well, just in relation to the water supply proving test, because I think that's pertinent to this discussion. There's a lot to cover, so let's just dive straight in. So the first thing I wanted to just bring up is table 4.4. And to me, I think there's a bit of a problem here. I don't know if anybody else thinks this. Maybe Greg, do you see there's a problem in the way that this table is laid out in the standard?
Point 4. I do with point 4. I do with...
Well, not point 4 specifically, but the whole table. Like, it's my position that the whole thing's a bit dysfunctional because we've got the major components in the sequence. We've got the major components. I'm just going to put somebody who's not on mute here for a sec. We've got the booster test and the hydrostatic. The booster connection flow test and the hydrostatic test at the start before we've done the maintenance activities. So perhaps you could talk to that, Greg.
Yeah. Okay. So you've touched on 4.4 again there. The valve overhauls. Look, I believe it should be valve. Well, it's a grey area, isn't it? If you do it, you're damned if you do it, damned if you don't. If you have, if we go with the valve overhauls prior to any testing, then are we going to have to do a second lot of testing? Or if we don't do the valve overhauls first, are we going to do the second lot of testing? So really, the valve overhauls first, flow test second, hydrostatic test third, is the way it should be in the testing side of it, because you can't if the pump appliance flow test has a boost pressure of 1133 kPa, you've already exceeded your 1700 kPa hydrostatic test. So you need to do that hydrostatic test last. That was the reason. That's my main problem with the order of things, Russ. The whole table, yeah.
So what I've done, Greg, is, and I've just noticed that Peter Atchison has said, you're right, the sequence of table 4.4 is out of order. The maintenance should be done first. And so what I've done in anticipation of our discussion today is refactor table 4.4 in the way that I think, as somebody who practices in this space, it should be done. So I believe, and I'm open, Bevan, to your thoughts on this, should we be doing the maintenance first prior to doing any testing?
Yes, I believe so. Should be, as stated, which is how we do it at AFT. We generally go through our maintenance schedule first. So monthly, 6 monthly, annual. And actually from our annual is where we will fail for a 5 yearly if it is due. And then that's how we then come to do the 5 yearly service. So with that, we'll then do the maintenance side. So going over the booster assembly, replacing hydrant landing valves, or replacing the washers on those valves. Basically all the maintenance items before we then do the actual flow test. So that is how we actually operate.
Yeah, and Peter's confirming what you said, and I popped his profile on the screen. He's saying exactly, do the hydrostatic test last. Yes. So we're going to just go through this table now, and we're going to cover off each of the components because there's only 10 items. And often what I hear in the industry is people say, hey, we need to do the hydrostatic test of the hydrant system. And what that actually means is, and what insurance companies want, is they want to see that all of the 5 yearly routine service activities have been completed, not just the hydrostatic test. And I think that that's a problem in our industry that we can address today and bring and highlight and focus on all of those maintenance activities, so that we can then perform the flow test, the pump appliance flow test, and the hydrostatic test after all of that other maintenance activity work has been done. So the first step in the table is to do all of the other routine service activities. I think the big thing we can talk about here, and Darren, you're probably a great person to talk about the maintenance requirements for hydrant systems, maybe not specifically, but the importance of particularly doing things like the survey and the other activities covered in tables 4.4.1, 4.4.2, 4.4.3. So Darren, over to you.
This standard, and I apologise to those who may be involved in it, needs some major corrections made to it. In a way, it's not fit for purpose. So, check all pressure gauges. What does that mean? Do I just go and say, yeah, look at it, that's a check, tick, right? It really should be verify the performance of the calibrated gauge, so that it's within 5% of a calibrated gauge or something like that. A descriptive tells you exactly what is required. Renew. Well, what does that mean? We can take it as a thing, but replace with new, I think, would be a better way of putting that. So there's some general comments about, the standard itself that needs to be addressed. But specifically, if we're talking about those earlier ones, that need for 1851 to be upgraded. So it's much more definitive as to what the outcomes need to be. So where they actually put in, a value, that's fantastic in 1851. So it says, the pressure gauges are all within 5% or whatever else. That's highly important when it comes to being able to validate whether a person is, and also give certainty to the person who's testing. When you leave it up to the technician, that's a problematic for the poor technician, because he's got to, decide what this really means. And if he gets it wrong, there's some liability goes against his boss. Now, the boss should probably be getting into the game more and making sure that they're doing that. But I think that they need to, that's where I've got an issue. Probably shouldn't have an issue, but I think where the standard really needs to be improved. If you're talking specifically about design surveys, that's going to depend. So, realistically, I don't think that the design survey comments really fit for purpose again. I think that it remains current arrangement for the building. Doesn't mean we haven't put piles of stuff in the way that stop the ability of the firefighters to get their hoses to where they need to be.
I've got a good question from Josh in New South Wales, where 1851's not yet legislated, and there's a committee within the Fire Protection Association that covers routine servicing of fire protection systems and equipment. And the discussion was yesterday, even though it's not 1851's not legislated in New South Wales, is there an obligation by contractors to undertake routine servicing in accordance with 1851, irrespective of whether it's a legislative requirement? Darren, you are definitely the best person to answer this question, I reckon.
So Darren has a very different opinion to this. Darren doesn't believe that it should be legislated in New South Wales at all. The annual fire safety statements cover it. The problem with legislation is that it's a very blunt tool, and therefore you don't allow a client and a contractor to come to an agreement on what is appropriate for their site. If the pipe work is at a stage, don't get me wrong, it needs to be fit for purpose. But to put it to a hydrostatic test, which is greater than what is required by the fire brigade, is that really fit for purpose necessarily for that installation? And this is where what activities are undertaken and what aren't is something that I think needs to be considered. In a lot of cases, I'll simply suggest that no one is really truly compliant with 1851 as a general rule. If I did a proper audit against a company against the standard and what they're doing, obviously the standard in the way it's written doesn't help at all. If you look at 4.6 fit new packing glands and lubricate spindle, they should be separate as an item. Fit new packing glands, full stop, lubricate spindle, full stop. Because is the fit new lubricant to the spindle, or what are they really saying? It just needs to be much better defined, in my opinion, if you're going to legislate.
I guess the discussion that we had in the technical committee yesterday was that 1851, while it might not be a legislative requirement, there is enough precedent in 1851 being the standard of performance to which we should be maintaining our systems, that it should be it's the community's minimum expectation. So I think, irrespective of whether it's legislated in New South Wales or not, it's the minimum community standard to which we should be operating. Anyway, I don't want to get bogged down on that today. I don't want to get bogged down on that one. We have a whole argument about that one for another time, Darren. What I do want to do, though, is quickly go through these sections that I think what I would classify as the maintenance activities first. And I've got Peter posing another statement. The pressure gauge is easier to replace. It served its purpose for 5 years. The cost to replace a pressure gauge during the 5-yearly with a new liquid-filled gauge is easy and would cost less than checking against a calibrated gauge. That might be the case, but one of the things we talk about in 1851 for the next edition is there a sustainable approach to some of these things? We do need to consider sustainability as part of our approach to routine servicing in the future. So that's a good one. But let's just go on through the table. We just touched on the water supply, the gauges. Now let's talk about the water supply non-return valves. Maybe, Bevan, you could have a talk to this one. I see this as one of the big failure points in 1851, where you've got a backflow prevention device that's passing water while we're trying to do the hydrostatic test.